In 1977, this battle also became known as a Hollywood war film, produced from a screenplay by William Goldman and based on the book A Bridge Too Far, translated as A Bridge Too, much of which became well known through the popular military history writing of the Irish-American journalist and author Cornelius Ryan, who wrote extensively about World War II. Both the book translated into German and the title of the Anglo-American film are called The Bridge of Arnhem and focus on the airborne battle for Arnhem, which took place from September 17th to 26th, 1944, and was a complete failure for the Allies. This operation was given the double name Market Garden, with Market standing for the planned and shown in red capture of 9 strategically important bridges by almost 40,000 deployed or airborne Anglo-American and Polish paratroopers. And Garden, shown in green, stood for the subsequent advance of 8 motorized infantry and 2 armored brigades toward the Ruhr area. With this operation, they wanted to bypass the West Wall, shown in green. And while both the commander of the 30th British Corps deployed in the battle since August 4, 1944, Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, and the former commander of the 1st British Airborne Division, Major General Robert Urquhart, while they had been used as advisors during filming, and the supposed accuracy had been praised especially in Britain, the British writer Robin Nealance, who dealt with military topics and was himself a former commando, had noted, "Nonsensical veterans urge me to ignore most of the story in the film, A Bridge Too Far." This can also already be said for the English title, because the title was supposed to suggest that they were actually successful, if only the last bridge hadn't been there, the one in Arnhem over the branch of the Rhine. This indirectly followed the statement of U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had said that the operation was 50% successful. Meanwhile, the British Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was responsible for the risky and disastrous plan, even seriously declared that this operation, for which he was responsible and which failed completely in every aspect, was 90% a success. Well, in reality as well as in the film, things happened quite differently. For example, the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, portrayed by actor Wolfgang Price, is informed that the troops have no fighting spirit at all. But in fact, the opposite was true, because otherwise the Allied forces, which were superior in every area from the beginning of the battle, would have broken through without any problems. Or the always heroic British heroes, who stand openly in their tank hatches and give tough orders even under the deadliest fire. And the death-defying Allied paratrooper commanders facing the Germans, who in the 5th year of the war are equipped with immaculate uniforms, while the German tank commanders always drive their tanks at a snail's pace and in tight groups through enemy defensive fire until they are all destroyed, of course, also standing in the hatch. And the supposedly given cynical order by SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, played by Maximilian Schell, that Arnhem should be leveled, also does not correspond to historical truth. Because after the Netherlands capitulated during the Western Campaign on May 14, 1940, Arnhem had been relatively spared from the war, except for an American bombing raid that took place on February 22, 1944. But when the exceptionally fierce fighting broke out after the Allied landing on September the 17th, 1944, both sides fought each other with everything they had at their disposal. From then on, Arnhem became part of the front until April 16, 1945, and presented this picture. In any case, it was and still is wrong to pretend that the Germans were actually defeated during that week in September 1944, if it hadn't been for that one bridge too many. But such distortions at the expense of serious historical analysis always happen when, like the so-called Internet encyclopedia, only Allied sources are used. Originally, Operation Market Garden was called Comet and was planned as a purely British-Polish operation. But then, with the inclusion of the 1st Allied Airborne Army and ground troops, it was expanded into Operation Market Garden, which is considered the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare. This 1st Allied Airborne Army consisted of the American 18th Airborne Corps, with the 13th, 17th, 82nd, and 101st Airborne Divisions. The 1st British Airborne Corps, with the 1st and 6th Airborne Divisions. The 52nd Infantry Division, the Special Air Service with 5 Special Service Brigades, the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade under British command, and the 9th Troop Carrier Command of the United States Army Air Forces with 5 Anglo-American squadrons of transport planes and gliders. So, what was the situation before Operation Market Garden? After a 14-day, almost non-stop assault against the German front along the southern Dutch Canal and river barriers, the Marschelde shown in yellow and the Albert Canal shown in green, by 12 battle-hardened, well-equipped divisions of the British Second Army under Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, there was suddenly calm on the night of September 16th to 17th, 1944. The attempt by the Allied forces to achieve a breakthrough at this section of the front, and thus open up the advance routes to northern Germany and the Ruhr area, had failed. In fact, some leading officers of the Allied general staffs gave little chance of success to a new offensive, also in view of the upcoming period of bad weather and the winter. But the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, U.S. General Dwight T. Eisenhower, had made the momentous decision to achieve a breakthrough before winter, with a surprise attack at the only point on the German front in the Netherlands that was not secured by any defense system. For this purpose, the aforementioned 1st Allied Airborne Army had been ready in Great Britain since August 2nd, 1944. After the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, shown on the left in the picture, who was known for his sometimes unimaginative and rigid operational plans that had always been carried out only with overwhelming superiority, had also pushed through his plan with Eisenhower against the one proposed by the commander of the 12th U.S. Army Group, U.S. General Omar Bradley, shown on the right. All preparations for Market Garden were now underway. Bradley, standing in the middle, had proposed an advance by the 3rd U.S. Army under Lieutenant General George S. Patton, shown on the left in the picture, through Lorraine and into the Saarland, which did not fit at all into the plans of Montgomery, shown on the right, who was always somewhat jealous of the slightly eccentric Patton. He wanted to be the first to march into Germany. Looking at the German side in the defense sector of the Netherlands, the situation there looked rather bleak. Although areas of terrain that could be suitable for tank attacks or airborne landings had been flooded, such as in the far southwest, Zeelandic Flanders, at this point in the war, in September 1944, this section was more or less stripped of combat-ready troops. So, on August 15, 1944, under the command of the Army troops in the Netherlands, with the 88th Army Corps under General of the Airmen Friedrich Christiansen, there were only the 347th Infantry Division, with the attached Turkestan Infantry Battalion, 787, the 719th Infantry Division, with the attached Armenian Infantry Battalion, 812, and the commander of the Waffen-SS Netherlands, who, however, had left the command area by September 1944. As for the mentioned floods, by the way, this method was also used by the Allies for military strategic purposes. For example, General Eisenhower had agreed to flood the heavily fortified Dutch peninsula of Walcheren, which was the last obstacle for the Allies to be able to use the port of Antwerp, starting from October 3rd, 1944, with a series of devastating dike bombings by the Royal Air Force. During the bombings, 158 Dutch civilians lost their lives, and the village of Westkapelle was completely destroyed. But this also massively hindered the German defense by the 70th Infantry Division under General Wilhelm Daser, whose troops in the 6 Grenadier battalions all suffered from stomach illnesses, hence the name Stomach or White Bread Division. So much so that the Allies were able to gain control over the mouth of the Western Scheldt. In addition, due to the increasingly noticeable shortage of personnel and supplies, most German units generally had only about 50% or less of their required strength. For example, the heavily battered and depleted 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, under its commander, SS Obersturmbannführer and Lieutenant Colonel of the Waffen, SS, Walter Harzer, consisted only of a battle group of a few thousand men during the fighting at the invasion front, and was now heading towards Siegen in the Siegerland region for what was called refitting. What was still somewhat operational from the 9th Division, including a Panzer Grenadier battalion and the remaining heavy weapons, had been handed over to the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg under SS Brigade Führer and Major General of the Waffen SS Heinz Hammel. The 9th had only left alarm units with a total strength of about 2,500 men in the area of Arnhem. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had been appointed Commander-in-Chief West and simultaneously took command of Army Group B since August 16th, portrayed by Walter Kohut in the feature film, had not expected a large-scale airborne operation. However, he was also not, as claimed in the film, sitting with his staff in the Villa Hartenstein on Utrechtseweg in Oosterbeek, 5 kilometers east of Arnhem, which was damaged during the fighting and therefore did not have to, as theatrically shown, flee his supposed headquarters in haste during the Allied attack. Instead, he had his command post in the Hotel Tafelberg in Oosterbeek, which was also later damaged. In September 1944, only part of his staff was housed in the Villa Hartenstein. Even the attacks that took place on September 16th, just before midnight, by 200 British Avro Lancaster bombers and 23 de Havilland Mosquitoes on 4 German airfields in the north of the Netherlands had not yet given any cause for concern. It was different, however, with the air raids on the morning of the 17th on the airfields at Dalen, Ede, and Eindhoven, as well as the attacks by 822 B-17S of the 8th U.S. Air Force on 117 known German anti-aircraft positions, which were located along the planned approach corridors for the transport planes and gliders of the airborne divisions. But in Arnhem on Sunday the 17th, it remained quiet until noon under brilliant sunshine. The streets were filled with numerous Dutch cyclists and pedestrians who were taking advantage of the mild late autumn weather for an outing. Then, almost out of the blue, 212 P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes attacked the German anti-aircraft positions, while 48 B-25 and 24 Douglas A-20 bombers bombed the Wilhelms barracks in Nijmegen, which was used by the Wehrmacht, as well as barracks in Dalen, Ede, and in the German town of Kleve. Then, coming from the west and watched by the locals, over a distance of 150 kilometers, wave after wave of incoming Allied transport squadrons appeared, secured by 1,100 fighter planes, towing gliders and dropping paratroopers. By about 1:30 p.m., the first paratroopers of the 1st British Airborne Division had been dropped and landed, mostly to the west near Arnhem, without encountering any significant resistance. Their assault troops had entered the Villa district and the city center, capturing a number of unsuspecting German soldiers and communications auxiliaries, like here Irene Ryman, who first smoked a lucky strike. Or here, the very tall army sergeant who needed 6 British soldiers to guard him at once. Hundreds of English gliders had also landed in the Rhine lowlands north of Arnhem, and, with their heavy weapons that had also landed, reinforced the thousands of paratroopers who had jumped. In a short time, north of the town of Sun, shown in green, 10 kilometers from Eindhoven, the 502nd and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments of the 101st United States Airborne Division, under Major General Taylor, had established themselves and, as marked in blue, blocked the bridges at Veghel. And the 82nd U.S. Airborne Division, under Brigadier General Gavin, had succeeded in the south in capturing the Maas Bridge at Grave and the light blue marked crossings over the Maas Wall Canal. Only the Nijmegen Bridge, where the 1st Battalion of the SS Panzergrenadier Battalion, 22 in the 10th Division, Frundsberg under Hauptsturmführer Karl-Heinz Euling, had opposed the Americans, remained in German hands. But in this situation, which was actually desperate for the few German defensive forces, the measures previously taken by the commander of the Waffen-SS in Holland, Obergruppenführer, and General of the Waffen-SS, Karl Damelhuber, for conducting the defensive battle proved to be decisive, because the claim that can be read, that the German forces were completely unprepared for a possible airborne operation in this area, is not correct. As early as April 1944, after taking over the Dutch section of the Atlantic Wall, Karl Damelhuber had conducted a war game with all the commanders of the units under his command, practicing the defense against an airborne landing in every detail. Participants included the staffs of the Waffen-SS garrison units and those of the 20th Naval Training Detachment of the Kriegsmarine, located 20 kilometers west of Arnhem in ED, with 20 companies under frigate captain, engineer Aimé Surmeyer. The sailors were stationed in 2 barracks near the train station, the Johann Willems Frisco, which had been renamed Commodore Bonte Barracks, and the Moritz Barracks. Also participating was the staff of the Parachute Panzer Replacement and Training Regiment Hermann Göring, based in Utrecht, under Major General Fritz Fulreda. In addition, General Damelhuber had arranged at that time for the SS Panzergrenadier Training and Replacement Battalion 16, under the command of Sturmbannführer Sepp Kraft, to remain north of Arnhem to protect the Rhine crossing, and for a small combat group to be deployed for the constant security of the wall bridge at Zaltbommel. On September 17th, the day market garden began, Battalion Kraft had 13 officers, 73 non-commissioned officers, and 349 enlisted men. From the 19th, it became the reinforced Kampfgruppe Kraft, which included attached Navy and Air Force alert units, among others. On the 17th, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Obergruppenführer Bittrich, in the center of the picture, had already alerted the Kampfgruppe of the 9th SS Panzer Division, made up of widely scattered alert units and led by Obersturmbannführer Harzer, at 1:40 p.m. Here you can see him after the battle in a captured Willys Jeep. After the alert units had achieved marching readiness within an hour, the brief order came: 2nd SS Panzer Corps, attack the enemy immediately and destroy him. Deployed for this are, in the Arnhem sector, Kampfgruppe of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen toward Oosterbeek and the bridge north of the Lower Rhine. At Nijmegen, the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. With only a small number of heavy weapons, without sufficient transport, and even worse, without essential coordination, the small Hohenstaufen battle group was set in motion. First, to reach the Allied withdrawal area as quickly as possible, and second, to prevent the enemy from regrouping by launching an immediate attack, or at least to disrupt them until stronger forces could be brought up. Only 10 trucks were available for transporting the soldiers. To speed up the movement, the troops requisitioned horse-drawn wagons, bicycles, motorcycles, and cars. In Arnhem, where the British paratroopers had landed on Utrechtse Weg near Wolfheze, the city commander of Field Command, 642 Major General Friedrich Küssen, had meanwhile deployed the previously mentioned Training and Replacement Battalion 16 Kraft in a defensive line between Oosterbeek and Wolfheze against the rapidly advancing enemy. When General Küssen was unable to establish radio contact with Kraft in the afternoon, he personally drove to Kraft's command post at the Hotel Wolfheze around 5:15 p.m., with his driver, Private Joseph Willeke, Air Force Junior Sergeant Willy Haupt, and Engineer Junior Sergeant Max Koester to get information about the situation there. However, when Küssen took the same route back to Arnhem in his Citroën, he and his 3 companions were shot dead by soldiers of the 5th Platoon of the British 3rd Parachute Battalion immediately after their departure. And while the 1st Assault Troops of the 9th SS Panzer Division attacked the fiercely resisting enemy in front of and inside Arnhem to prevent further advances, hastily assembled alarm units from the rear areas were now being sent into action. Composed of platoons from the Reichslabor Service, field railway units, ship crew and command staff, lightly wounded soldiers from the wards and hospitals, Dutch Landstorm, and recruit companies. Meanwhile, the British transport planes had dropped one paratrooper battalion after another, along with their heavy equipment. When the death of General Küssen was reported, the commander of the 9th SS Division, Obersturmbannführer Walter Harzer, took command of all German formations and units fighting at Arnhem. When British paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion tried to seal off the north side of the Arnhem Bridge, which they had occupied, at around 5 o'clock, this was prevented by the 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion under the 30-year-old Hauptsturmführer Victor Eberhard Grabner, who was killed the following day. After that, the Reconnaissance Battalion moved all its marches to the south in order to prevent the planned union of the Allied airborne units landed at Arnhem and Nijmegen. Additional assault troops of the 9th Division were able to successfully seal off Arnhem from the drop zones. And while German and English units fought each other with stubborn determination in an increasingly confined space well into the night, Lieutenant Colonel Harzer had managed to establish an initial loose defensive front up to the Old Rhine. The map shows in blue the hedgehog position of the British Airborne Division, and in red the German units attacking them. Then, as the night went on, the first planned counterattack by German units took place against the numerically superior and well-equipped enemy. While on the morning of the 18th, the battle group Tettau, formed from Waffen-SS units, naval personnel, airfield staff, and army units, led by Lieutenant General Hans von Tettau, was approaching Arnhem from the west. The 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, had managed, despite significant losses, to fight and secure the only solid supply route to the south. It can be said without exaggeration that the costly deployment of the 10th Division at Nijmegen, as well as the leadership of its commander, Major General Heinz Harmel, here seen talking with captured officers of the British Airborne Division, played a decisive role in the defeat of this large-scale Allied airborne operation. In the course of September 18th, with the arrival of new reserves, the front could be extended to the northern bank of the Rhine, during which the 2nd British Parachute Battalion, still stubbornly defending itself at the bridge under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, was cut off. After fierce fighting cleared Arnhem's city center, Lieutenant Colonel Harzer personally led his battle group of no more than 3,500 men against Oosterbeek. Especially here, a house-to-house battle raged in a very confined space between evenly matched opponents, neither of whom was willing to give up even a meter of ground voluntarily, but who also repeatedly took prisoners. On the evening of September 18th, new waves of British paratroopers were dropped, followed by the almost unhindered landing of artillery and heavy weapons, due to the lack of anti-aircraft weapons in the battle group of the 9th Division. At the same time, on the German side, the Knaus battle group, which was subordinated to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, arrived, led by Major Hans-Peter Knaust. It consisted of the tank company under 1st Lieutenant Mielke, with 6 Panzer III and 2 Panzer IV tanks, and the Panzer Grenadier Training and Replacement Battalion, 64 with 4 companies, which were made up of recruits with 4 weeks of training, and whose officers were almost without exception severely wounded veterans and actually unfit for frontline duty. Together with the 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, the Knaus battle group was assigned to attack the bridge at Arnhem, now supported by the 16-15 centimeter Nebelwerfer 41 rocket launchers of the Nickman Battery under Hauptsturmführer Alfred Nickman, with which the entire British bridgehead was effectively engaged. When the British paratroopers recognized the danger of being encircled, they launched fierce attacks against the blocking elements of the Harzer battle group, and repeatedly tried to relieve the 2nd British Paratrooper Battalion, which was trapped on the north side of the bridge. Meanwhile, the other British units had turned the residential houses into heavily armed fortresses and set up field positions in the front gardens. The British fighting against the improvised German units were exclusively seasoned and tough soldiers from traditional English regiments, mostly battle-hardened and highly decorated officers or non-commissioned officers. But in the particularly fiercely contested Arnhem and Oosterbeek, the German soldiers fought them for every meter in close combat. On September 19th, Svoboda's anti-aircraft brigade had been brought in with 24 88 Aufmonirsts and 26 20 Ostdammer anti-aircraft guns, which were now used to fight the ongoing withdrawal and landing of paratroopers. By swinging its right flank to the left, the battle group of the 9th SS Panzer Division was able to begin encircling the desperately resisting British. In order to clear the road bridge at Arnhem starting on the 20th, the houses heavily fortified by the English were attacked by individual field howitzers from open firing positions, and sometimes from very close range. In these battles for the numerous and cleverly constructed British strongpoints, Kampfgruppe Knaust and the 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion suffered particularly heavy losses. Soldiers from this unit had also fallen into British captivity. On the 5th day of the battle, the fate of the brave British paratroopers was sealed. The American units had become stuck in their bridgehead at Nijmegen, and none of the Allied units had been able to accomplish their mission. Because despite the complete surprise on the German side and the overwhelming Allied superiority in the initial stage of the battle, the airborne troops had failed against the improvised defense of the hastily assembled Wehrmacht units. After the British units had been encircled, the possibility of a successful breakout diminished with each passing hour, especially since they rightly had to expect that more and more powerful and armored reinforcements would be brought in by the Germans. Even the attacks by British bombers on Arnhem could do nothing to change their desperate situation. The only ones who suffered were the Dutch residents of the city. For this reason, and of course also for military reasons, Field Marshal Model, here on the left with the commander of the 10th Division Frundsberg, had ordered the Dutch city administration of Arnhem on the 23rd that the residents of the city were to evacuate within 2 days, which was followed by 50,000 inhabitants. Meanwhile, the commander of the 1st British Airborne Division, Lieutenant General Urquhart, here in front of his command post in Arnhem, had tried in vain to hold as large a bridgehead as possible west of Arnhem, in order to enable further supply of his division by air. But the edges of the pocket had been increasingly pressed in by the ever more intense German attacks. Another attempt to support the desperate, struggling British by air and to land new troops was destroyed in the concentrated fire of the German defenses, with numerous enemy aircraft shot down and the freshly dropped English paratroopers captured by the hundreds. Almost all of the dropped supplies had also fallen into German hands. On the morning of the 21st, the soldiers of the 2nd British Paratrooper Battalion, cut off at the bridge of Arnhem under Lieutenant Colonel Frost, had used up all their ammunition. After the breakout was halted by German fire, the remnants of this exceptionally brave and tenaciously fighting battalion surrendered after 88 hours of resistance. And after, in the early hours of September 22nd, the battle group of the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, attacked the main forces of the 1st British Division in 3 assault wedges, resulting once again in heavy and costly fighting for both sides. The English had to slowly give way. On the 24th, General Urquhart was therefore forced, at 9:15 p.m., to report the increasingly critical situation to the commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, including the account that the troops were completely exhausted, ammunition, food, and water were running out, and the losses among the officers were increasing. Finally, he had a message sent to Browning that they were no longer able to provide medical care for their estimated up to 1,500 wounded, as most of the medical supplies had been used up, and the majority of the newly dropped supplies had fallen into German hands. Up to this point, the fighting between the Germans and the British had been exceptionally fierce, but there had also been moments of camaraderie between opponents, such as when Wehrmacht soldiers arranged the burial of a fallen British soldier. But now something happened that had already taken place during the Normandy fighting in July 1944 in Saint-Mère-Église, but which is often dismissed in many reports with just a few insignificant words: the cooperation between Allied and German medical companies in caring for the wounded. Such an example of chivalry toward the enemy, which saved the lives of many wounded British and Polish soldiers, also took place in Arnhem, because the message from the British general had also been intercepted by the German radio defense. As a result, the division doctor of the SS Medical Unit 9 in the 9th Division, Sturmbannführer Dr. Egon Skalka, drove to the British main dressing station in Arnhem at the Hotel Schoonord in a captured British jeep, accompanied by a British prisoner of war who waved a Red Cross flag on the hood, where he met the British division doctor, Colonel Graham Warwick, and discussed with him the possibility of the SS medical units providing care for the wounded British soldiers. After both General Urquhart and General Bittrick had agreed, it was arranged that from then on, during agreed ceasefire periods, British wounded would be brought to the St. Elizabeth Hospital, which had been converted into a field hospital, and handed over there to the medical department of the 1st Division. By the end of the fighting, around 1,200 English wounded had been taken in this way. In addition, the 9th Division provided captured medical supplies and medications to the British medical vehicles returning to the pocket in order to ensure the care of the wounded at the front lines who did not want to fall into German hands. Here is the Hotel Tafelberg in Oosterbeek, which was also set up as a main dressing station. After the war, several British doctors who served in Arnhem described their positive experiences with the German medical personnel. Among them was Colonel Warwick. And in 1980, Walter Harzer received a letter of thanks from the former commander of the 1st British Airborne Division, Major General Urquhart. Many former British soldiers are still alive because of your humane decision during the rather unusual ceasefire of September 24, 1944, to allow British wounded to be taken to the Elizabeth Hospital in Arnhem. I thank you for that. I would also like to let you know that I had, and still have, great respect for the qualities of your old division. But despite this chivalrous German gesture, the fighting had continued relentlessly. As I mentioned at the beginning, the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, under Colonel Stanislaw Sosabowski, seen here on the left with General Browning, also took part in Operation Market Garden. His brigade was supposed to be dropped east of Arnhem, but on the 21st, due to wind and heavy anti-aircraft fire, it was scattered, and not all units landed south of Nijmegen near Grave. They were then drawn into heavy fighting with the German blocking force Harzer, led by Colonel Egon Gerhard. Later, Colonel Stanislaw Sosabowski was blamed by British generals for the failure of Operation Market Garden and was dismissed from military service in December 1944, although it is said that he was the one who had predicted that this operation would be a bridge too far. One bridge too far. Eventually, the Allied Air Force played a bigger role in ground battles. With bare weapons, the British paratroopers kept trying to fight for some breathing room, but all attempts by the Allies to supply or reinforce those who were encircled failed, just like the last attempt by British Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, who tried to break through to Arnhem from the south with his tank units of the 2nd Army. On the night of the 26th, the soldiers of the reinforced 1st British Airborne Division were barely able to resist anymore, since they had hardly received any supplies for days, and had also run out of drinking water. But the 10 British soldiers still did not give up, and fought fiercely when the equally exhausted German assault units launched their attack at dawn. The British breakout attempt, Operation Berlin, which was launched after several hours of American artillery barrage, was only partially successful. Only 1,816 British soldiers and 160 Poles had been evacuated across the Lower Rhine, including the division commander. You can see the joy of being free on the faces of the evacuees. 240 more soldiers were later brought out of the danger zone from the Lower Rhine by the Dutch resistance. These ones, however, didn't make it. Whether in civilian clothes or in uniform, they had been taken prisoner of war. Then the resistance had ceased, and the Germans inspected their spoils of war. With 1,485 dead, the 1st British Airborne Division, supposedly called the Red Devils by the Germans because of their maroon berets, had been so severely decimated, only 25% returned to England after Operation Market Garden, that it had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. With that, the airborne Battle of Arnhem was over, the last German victory in the West, in which numerous German units from all branches of the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Waffen-SS had participated. There are different figures regarding the losses. The Allies had between 15,326 and 17,200 soldiers killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. 88 tanks and 377 aircraft and gliders were destroyed. The German losses range between 6,400 and 8,000 killed or wounded. In and around Arnhem, numerous monuments commemorate the deployment of Allied troops to drive the Germans out of the Netherlands. 1,700 German soldiers who fell in the airborne battle in and around Arnhem are buried in the only German military cemetery in the Netherlands, in Escalation, which contains 31,598 graves.